This is CBS Eye on the World. I'm John Batchelor. It is 1896 in New York City. An exhibit called the Irish Palace, and a woman in her 80s, Kate Murphy, approaches the Irish Palace. There's a rope line around this vast floor decoration, 25 by 25 feet. And on that floor is painted the counties of Ireland. And each county has soil from that county that's been brought specially to New York for the Irish Palace. Kate Murphy must pay money to enter into this space to find her county, Fermanagh. This vivid scene is part of a storytelling of the Irish in New York. The book is Plentiful Country, the Great Potato Famine, and the Making of Irish New York. I welcome Professor Tyler Anbinder. He is the author and the compiler of this enormously helpful data to understand New York City here in the 21st century, to understand the stories of New York City the last 200 years, from the Civil War onward. Professor, congratulations and a very good evening to you. It's a great pleasure to talk Irish, especially because it's so much around me, wherever I am. I'm in Connecticut now. Irish around me here, right across the border, Irish everywhere. But once upon a time, the Irish were relatively rare in New York City before the crisis, the tragedy. Who is Kate Murphy? And what does she do after she pays her few pennies to enter this enormous map of Ireland? Good evening to you.
Good evening. It's great to be with you. Kate Murphy has lived in New York for decades. She's worked as a domestic servant. She's come from Ireland decades ago, and like most immigrants, is somewhat homesick and misses her homeland. And so in 1896, when there's this fundraising event held to in this effort to build a memorial to the Irish in America, and in particular to the Irish who came during the Great Famine 50 years earlier, they come up with this idea of building this giant map of Ireland and sending someone to Ireland to bring back soil from each of the 32 counties and place that soil within this large floor map that you've described, and then charge people admission to enter into the space, and so that they once again can stand on their native soil. And so Kate Murphy goes onto the map, walks to the middle, which is where Fermanagh is, and she is so moved by the thought of once again standing on the old sod that she gets down on her hands and knees and kisses the very ground she's standing on, and kisses her native soil. And the people around watch this poignant scene, and they can't help be struck by it. And there are tears in Kate's eyes. There are tears in the eyes of the people who are watching, and it shows how the Irish, even though they embraced America, they still felt this great sadness at times about what they had left behind.
Why do we have this book of the professors? Why does this exist? These detailed records of who they were, where they came from, where they were born, their parents, their wives, their children. Why do we have all of this? Because if you recall, the Castle Garden records and the Ellis Island records from early in this period of time in the 19th century were lost to fire. We have them because of Emigrant Savings Bank. Professor, you and I have agreed that if you tried this in a novel, it wouldn't work. There's no verisimilitude to this, but Emigrant Savings Bank, why do we have these detailed records? Who's responsible?
Well, when the Immigrant Savings Bank started in 1850, it was started by Irish Americans, particularly for the famine Irish immigrants. And the goal, and in those days, there's no government issued photo ID. And so when you go to the bank and ask for your money, the bank wants to make extra sure they're not giving your money to the wrong person. And because the famine Irish had so little, the Immigrant Savings Bank wanted to make extra sure that they weren't swindled by con men who might impersonate you and take your money. So the Emigrant Bank took down great detailed biographical information about each depositor, not just your name and your address and your occupation, but your your mother's maiden name. They're the first financial institution we know of to use your mother's maiden name as a security device. They took down the names of all your children, your siblings, where all those people were living, the name of the ship you arrived on, even the date it arrived. And then when you came to get your money, they would say, so if you're really Michael Shea, tell me where your oldest sister is living. And if you got that right, they'd say, okay, well then tell us also what was the date you arrived in America and the name of the ship. And they would use those things as test questions. And so the bank kept those records. The bank was located first in Lower Manhattan and then at Fifth Avenue and 42nd Street by the end of the 19th century. And as the bank in the 1990s needed to clear out room needed to make room for new records, they decided rather than just throw out the old records, as most did, they recognized the historical significance of these. And so they took these old test books, as they were known, across the street to the New York Public Library. And there they quickly became the most used manuscript collection in the entire library, because so many hundreds and thousands of Irish Americans who didn't really know much about their family's origins in the United States could find them in these records.
Yes, because there are 30 or 40 Michael Quinns at any one moment. You have an example in your book, an illustration. And a detail here is that it took account for when there was a deposit, when there was a withdrawal, when there was interest payment, because they had a rule that you had to keep $1 in. Is that my memory is? So oftentimes you had to leave $1 in your account, but you've used those records to tell the story of their labor and how they saved. Were the Irish unusual savers, or was this the culture at the time to save a $5 a week or $60 a week?
It's kind of a little of both. I mean, there's definitely a culture of saving in this period, right? This is before there's any government social safety net. And so if you fell on hard times, you knew you had to depend on either family or friends or yourself. And so most people made it a point to save an emergency fund in the bank that they could use if they became unemployed, if someone in the family became sick, because again, there's no health insurance either in those days. And so for that reason, people saved in general. The Irish saved in particular and were especially enthusiastic savers, because having been through the famine in Ireland, where they ran out of money and literally could not feed themselves and their families, they were scarred psychologically by this experience. Can you imagine not having enough money to feed your children, watching your children starve in front of your eyes? And so the Irish, once they got to America, became very determined savers, because they were absolutely determined not to ever let that happen to them again.
This book is a story of those lists of where they came from, who they are. The test books become the backbone of the telling of Plentiful Country, the Great Potato Famine, and the Making of Irish New York. Professor Tyler Anbinder is the author. The Potato Famine is a story of a virus traveling over oceans that were part of the route to explore the New World, but then the products of the New World came back to Europe. And one particular product was potato seed. Professor, I did not know where it came from. I presumed it was, that it just originated in Ireland. That is inaccurate. Why did potato seed carry the virus? Why didn't it take plant in, say, North America? Thank you.
So the seed potatoes that the Irish used to grow their own potatoes, because the way you grow potatoes is you put a little tiny potato in the ground and from it sprouts many potatoes. The seed potatoes that the Irish used came from North America, especially from the United States. And American farmers would fertilize their crop with guano, bird droppings that came from South America. And apparently in those bird droppings, there was a fungus. And the fungus didn't really affect potato growth in the United States very much, because we have hot, dry summers, and that would kill the fungus. But in Ireland, where you have cool, damp summers, the fungus was able to thrive and multiply, and in that way infect the crop of an entire nation.
The crop is the potato crop that was critical to feeding Ireland. This is another world where the British Empire did not take responsibility for the lives of people of Ireland, but they did take responsibility for the profits. So the professor takes us to the Lansdowne estate, which I see is at the border between Cork County and Kerry County. This is the poorest of the poor. When the potato famine struck, was 45, 46 in that zone. At first, they thought they could outlast it. They thought that the next year's crop, it would go away. Is that correct, Professor?
Right. There had been from time to time, things that had affected the potato crop and brought in a worse crop than usual. And so when the crop in 1845 is hit by this fungus, which people don't understand in those days is a fungus, they think, oh, well, we can get by until next year when next year's crop will be fine and then we'll do okay. But instead, in 1846, 90% of the potato crop is destroyed. And this is so important because, as you mentioned, the British Empire had so impoverished Ireland that, about half the Irish population was totally dependent on potatoes for their sustenance. They ate potatoes for breakfast, potatoes for lunch, and potatoes for dinner. It was the only thing they ate day after day, week after week, month after month, all year.
The potato was substantive until it went missing. And what we're looking at here is gradual famine, but it doesn't hit the Ireland all in the same place. My understanding is the west of Ireland got hit hardest because it was farthest away from the large cities. Why did it start in the west? Was that something to do with the weather, Professor?
So right. So the famine starts in the west in part because it's the wettest, dampest part of Ireland because the prevailing winds blow in from the Atlantic Ocean from west to east. So that's where the fungus is going to take hold first. Secondly, though, the west is the poorest part of Ireland in those days. And therefore, that's the part of the country where the people are most dependent on potatoes for their sustenance. And therefore, when the potato crop fails, those are the people who are going to begin to starve first. And also because it's the poorest, they have the least savings and the least ability to buy other kinds of food to get them by.
Yes, the Lansdowne estate is an example of what is true for all of Ireland. There are 750 landowners, I'm following the professor's reporting, who own everything. And to be a farmer in Ireland is different than being a farm laborer. Is this equivalent to what we would say is sharecroppers? Is that a farm laborer?
Not exactly, because though kind of. The difference would be is very often in the west of Ireland, a farm laborer is someone who's just working for somebody else as doing labor on their farm, whereas a sharecropper gets to, has some control over what they grow and when they work. Farm labor mostly has to go work when their employer tells them. But what would happen is somebody whose main occupation was farm labor, working for a more well-to-do farmer, would have his own basically large vegetable garden, maybe 1 acre on which he would plant potatoes to feed his family because the income from the farm labor wouldn't be enough to feed his family. Or very often the pay for being a farm laborer on someone else's farm was to be given a plot of land to grow your own potatoes on.
But they paid rent to the landowner, who is absentee all the time. Lansdowne certainly was the Marquis of Lansdowne. He was
Correct.
off in London. We're also talking about an extremely densely populated Ireland. I think you said it was about South Carolina size
Correct.
and very packed. So the famine immediately damages everyone's expectations. Lansdowne himself then decides to pay for the passage for 2,000 of his renters to America. Why did he do that? It doesn't strike me as a generous man. Was he trying to get rid of them? Was this an English prejudice I'm unaware of?
It was basically a financial decision. So the English, not wanting to have to pay for for helping people who were suffering during the famine, decided that the Irish landowners would have to pay the taxes that would support those who had been made indigent by the famine. Someone like Lansdowne, who had thousands of tenants, decided it was cheaper to pay to ship them to the United States rather than pay to feed them for what could be many years, because by the time Lansdowne decides to do that, you're in the 4th or 5th year of the famine, and there's no end in sight. Nobody understands what this fungus is that's destroying the potatoes, and nobody understands how to stop it.
So he pays for the passage, and the families that make the decision to go are not the sickest and the weakest. They're the strongest of the lot, the ones who've survived the famine so far. So they become the famine Irish, though the real famine Irish never leave Ireland, as I understand. Their task now is to get to America. My note says they walked to Cork, they walked to Dublin, and they walked to Belfast, and then took a ship across to Liverpool. Is that where they departed America?
Correct. It was typical that even though it makes no sense to us today, though if you've ever had to travel the wrong direction to change planes to go to your ultimate destination, you would understand the cheapest way to get to America was from Liverpool. There was so many ships going from Liverpool that's where it was the cheapest. So most of the Irish traveled in the wrong direction from Ireland to Liverpool in England, and then took ships from Liverpool to America.
And these ships left intermittently. There was no schedule. When they were full, they left. They're small ships. They're not Titanics. And we're going to turn to what the famine Irish experienced on the voyage, 35 days across the Atlantic, and what they found when they arrived in New York City. The book is Plentiful Country, The Great Potato Famine and the Making of Irish New York. Professor Tyler Anbinder is the author. The famine Irish have taken the great risk of an ocean voyage to reach to America rather than stay in Ireland where they might starve to death. They are from all parts of Ireland, and they're coming to an unknown land. Professor, the trip itself was a test of one's not just endurance and patience, given that you were packed together in steerage or on the deck of a very small ship, but at the same time, you were suddenly prey to all the diseases and that can come to you if you're malnourished. So there was a phenomenon known as the coffin ships. What were those, Tyler?
So the coffin ships, that term refers to ships that came from Ireland to North America during the famine, on which disease spread rapidly, and large numbers of the immigrants died before they even made it to America. There were diseases like cholera, which was a waterborne illness, or typhus, which is a disease that you got that was spread by body lice on the ships. And when you're packed in steerage together, you're sharing beds with multiple people, often strangers. And so it was easy to get something like typhus, which was spread by lice jumping from one closely packed body to another. Now, only a tiny fraction of the famine immigrants would have come on coffin ships, because there weren't that many of them. And once it became clear what was happening on them, new regulations were put in place to prevent such huge disease on ships. But still, the story of the coffin ships scarred so many of the potential immigrants and made them very scared to come to America, and very fearful that they might die on the voyage. On your typical ship, maybe 1 in 100 passengers would die. And on the typical ship, you had 400 or 500 passengers. But on a coffin ship, it would be 40 or 50 out of 500 who would die.
Arriving in New York, this is before Castle Garden, which was before Ellis Island.
Right.
There is no ceremony. They're checked for typhus. I guess that happens while they're still at sea or coming into New York Harbor.
Yes.
And they're greeted by what? There are no officials. Do they have family there? Have they written ahead, or are they completely on their own?
They're really completely on their own because it's impossible to know when a ship is going to arrive. There's no schedule. It just arrives when the wind happens to blow them in. And if the wind is particularly fortuitous, you might make it to America in a month. If the wind was average, it would take 5 weeks, but it could take even 6 or 7 weeks. So nobody knew when a ship was going to arrive. So you just got the ship docked on the East River, and people stumbled off, and that was how you started your life in America. That, like you said, there was no inspection other than what you had out in the harbor to make sure you weren't actively sick. But as long as you didn't have a fever at the moment you arrived, you just walked off the ship and began your life in America.
The professor provides an image of New York in 1848, 1849. The winter of 47 was known as the Black 47. So there are people who are coming in the late 1840s. New York didn't have towers. It was brick built with church steeples. That's what they saw when they entered New York Harbor. We need to have an example now. Bartholomew O'Donnell, called Bartley, with his mother Mary, with his two sisters, with the baby Cornelius. Bartley needs to pay for his family, and they clearly have, you logically deduce they have no money because they go to the old brewery in 5 Points. What was that?
So 5 Points was the most impoverished neighborhood in New York, and it was predominantly Irish in the period of the Great Famine. And then within the neighborhood, like 5 Points, you had your better tenements and your worst tenements. And the very worst tenement in 5 Points in this era was known as the Old Brewery. It was called that because it had been a beer brewery until the owners decided they could make more money subdividing it and renting it out as tenement apartments. But because it had been built as an industrial building rather than for housing, many of the apartments had no windows at all and were interior apartments. And so the conditions there were, it was dark, it was dirty. Thieves loved taking their ill-gotten goods into the building because the police were afraid to go in there. And so it was basically the worst tenement in 5 Points. And that's, we know, is where Bartholomew O'Donnell and his family moves when they first get to New York. Now, eventually they move on to other places because the tenement is so bad that reformers buy it from its owner and tear it down to build a Methodist mission.
Bartley, however, has a family to feed and he immediately goes to work. I like that. Day labor, what does that mean in Manhattan in 1848, 1849?
So day labor in New York in that period meant overwhelmingly working on a construction site. Right? So today, all the things that are done by machines on construction sites were mostly done by men with shovels and pickaxes and so forth. And so what Bartholomew O'Donnell would have done on his construction sites are he would have used a pickaxe to dig the holes that made the basements and foundations of the tenements and other buildings that he built. Then he would have been in charge of putting bricks and mortar on his back and shoulders and carrying them up rickety ladders up to the masons who would build the brick walls that made up the buildings that were being constructed. And he would do that for one building after another, and then move on to another job and another. And it was backbreaking work, and you had to do it in the heat and in the cold and in the rain. But nonetheless, that was what the Irish did. That was the number one job for Irish male immigrants when they got to America, and he did that for years.
The professor has obliged us with a chart that shows what work was chosen by the unskilled workers as they left these harried Manhattan shore as they get off the ship. 59% to unskilled workers, 5% to peddlers, 6% to skilled workers, 8% to lower status white collar, 22% to business owners, and 0.4% to professionals. In other words, there was a scale. And what's impressive about all the stories that the professor tells is that everybody had that scale in their minds. They were looking to better themselves and provide for their children who could be even better than they were in terms of this scale from unskilled workers to professionals, doctors and lawyers. Bartley has that in mind. He also goes to Emigrant Savings Bank right away with the first money he has. I take it that that is typical. It's in the neighborhood that what you do with money is you don't keep it in under your mattress where it can be stolen during the day. You take it to the bank.
Exactly. That's the kind of thing that a lot of people who look at my book don't understand. They think, oh, well, only rich people would have opened bank accounts. But in fact, it was the opposite, because tenement apartments, the tenement building you lived in had no lock on the front door. Your tenement apartment had no lock on the door. So anybody could waltz into your building and into your apartment if you weren't there. And very often for the Irish, everybody was out during the day working. And so as a result, and fire was also such a common threat. And so it's actually the poorest New Yorkers who are more likely to open bank accounts than more well-to-do New Yorkers who could afford to put a safe in their house, or could afford to put a lock on their doors, or had servants in their house day and night who could make sure no strangers walked in. So that's kind of a myth that I've had to disabuse people of in this book. It's actually the poorer people who are more likely to have bank accounts.
Also arriving in Famine Irish are Dennis and Ellen O'Keefe. Now, this is a wonderful story because it's got a mystery inside of it. They begin in Manhattan, Emigrant Savings Bank, an account, $5, $60, $160 year to year. And then all of a sudden, 1860 arrives and their account swells to at some point as much, I believe, as $6,000. You have an explanation, Professor. Is it the war? Is it law, or is it Mr. O'Keefe is clever and somebody tells him about tobacco?
It's really all of those things. So one thing that is not well known about the Famine Irish is that, like all immigrants, really, they were very entrepreneurial. They might start out in day labor or jobs like that. Dennis O'Keefe, for example, started as a porter. He'd be at the train station or the ferry dock, and if you got off and you had luggage or packages to carry, he would carry it for you for a small fee. He starts out that way and supports his family as a porter, but eventually takes his savings and sees during the Civil War that there's a huge shortage of tobacco. New Yorkers, like all Americans, are very addicted to tobacco back then, and yet the supply of tobacco is cut off because of the Civil War. So he goes into the tobacco business. We don't know how he's getting tobacco from the South, but somehow he is, and he sells it at a big markup, and he makes himself a small fortune that way, and becomes one of the wealthiest of the Emigrant Savings Bank's depositors. However, another thing that we learned from his story is that, easy come, easy go was sometimes the case for these people, especially if you didn't hedge your bets. And apparently O'Keefe kept his money in tobacco too long. After the Civil War, there was a glut of tobacco back in New York, and he loses his business and has to go back to the more menial kinds of work, not quite being a porter, but doing kind of being a clerk and other kinds of lower white collar jobs. But he had a small fortune during the Civil War. But though he invested some of it in Brooklyn real estate, and so he doesn't end up that badly off, but not quite the wealthy man he was for a couple of years at the height of the war.
Ward 1 was where I believe that was 5 points in Ward 1. We're going to another ward. Ward 4 is my guess, but I don't have the map in front of me. Correct me if I got that wrong, Tyler. This is important. To the Bodoni Parish Famine Irish, who lived together in and around the east side of Manhattan. In general, the immigrants who are coming in, and up to nearly 1 million come into New York in this period of Famine Irish, to a New York, and they pass through, they don't all stay, to a New York that was about less than 400,000 beginning this process.
Right.
One group, the Bodoni Parish from Ireland, settles together and they become vendors. That is a leg up from the day laborer. And they're vending charcoal. Do I remember that correctly?
Correct. And so one of the things we find with the Famine Irish and with immigrants throughout New York's history is that networking is a key way in which they gain a foothold in New York. So the Irish immigrants don't just randomly go into one job or another. When they get to America, they find people from their part of Ireland and say, where should I live? Can you help me find a job? And so as a result, people from different parts of Ireland tend to go into different kinds of work. And the people from this one parish of Bodoni, which is in County Tyrone in Northern Ireland, the first immigrants from there have gone into the business of charcoal vending, as you mentioned, or charcoal peddling. And so the immigrants from Bodoni, when they get to New York, more often than not become charcoal peddlers also, until they come to dominate charcoal peddling in the Irish communities of New York. And it turns out it's a very good way to make money. And we can look at the bank accounts of these immigrants, and they save far more, not only than the day laborers, but even more than skilled artisans, and more than most Irish New Yorkers, with the exception of people like saloon keepers and policemen. So it turns out that peddling, even though it wasn't a very high status job, was actually very lucrative.
Yes, of the 275,000, the professor's reporting, employed in New York in 1860, 5,000 were peddlers. A twist here, again, you can't make this up. Gold in Bodoni Parish. Gold, which they haven't exploited yet, correct? They're holding off.
Yes, so if you go to that part of County Tyrone today, which I've done, it's gorgeous. It's in the Sperrin Mountains, and so it's just beautiful landscape. But right, in recent years, they've discovered gold under those hills. It's one of the biggest gold finds ever in Europe, worth billions of dollars. Right, the gold hasn't been taken out of the ground yet because there's a fight going on between the corporations that have bought the rights to what's under the hills, and the people who live there who don't want their beautiful countryside destroyed in order to take the gold out of the ground. And so it hasn't been bought yet, but since the Irish who were coming from Bodoni to New York didn't own the land there anyway, they didn't give up much by coming to America and finding gold in charcoal peddling rather than staying in Ireland.
Tyler Anbinder, professor, is the author of Plentiful Country, The Great Potato Famine, and the Making of Irish New York. George Fox, one of my heroes in the book, because remember, they're always climbing the ladder of success towards being business owners, and he certainly climbs quickly to that elevated. He's a man who understands not only clothing, he understands marketing. What do we need to know about George Fox's success? Would he have been successful anywhere, or was it America that gave him the chance?
I think it's a combination of the two. So George Fox comes to New York, and he's already trained as a tailor, and so he goes to work making clothing for New York clothing retailers. Maybe Brooks Brothers, or maybe the Devlins, who were one of the biggest clothing retailers, and they were Irish who had come before the famine. But he's earning a pittance of a wage as a sewing clothes for other people, and he is very ambitious and wants to go into business for his own. So he opens up a storefront and starts selling clothes. At first, he aims his sales at other poor immigrants, but he realizes there's a lot more money to be made selling a few pieces of clothing to well-to-do New Yorkers at a high markup. So he closes his initial shop on Chamber Street, opens one on Broadway in a nice corner lot, and begins advertising prominently in the city's newspapers. And he's a great self-promoter, and that's one of the things that's really important if you want to be a success as an entrepreneur. Is you can't be afraid to brag about yourself. And so he bragged that he had the most stylish fashions at the best prices, and that any New Yorker would look fabulous wearing his clothes, and yet save money. And he promoted himself extravagantly with huge ads. He even went to Washington and gave cloth to prominent Washington politicians for free, with a note saying, if you come to my shop at the Willard Hotel, which he did as kind of a pop-up, he said, I'll make you your clothes. And so he ends up making clothes for President Millard Fillmore, for for famous senators, admirals, and so forth, and makes himself famous that way, making clothing for free for famous Americans, and then uses that fact to advertise his prominence, and goes on to be a very successful New York merchant tailor.
Yes, the tailors, the shoemakers, the carpenters, and the masons. There were categories. A journeyman means you work for someone else, I believe.
Yes.
And a master means you work for yourself. And they were never out of work. That was the one group that, because New York is building itself as they arrive, there's always work for them. And the transformation into a master is critical to their understanding. Again and again, these records are told through the Emigrant Savings Bank deposits, and you can follow the trail of success on the basis of how much money they're saving all the time they're working. And it's also a story of how when you get to certain rungs, the artisan rung, you might plateau there, but you want your children to come in there and start and go higher. So we're going to turn now to the story of not only the higher rungs that you can achieve, but also the children of the higher rungs. The book is Plentiful Country, The Great Potato Famine and the Making of Irish New York. Tyler Anbinder is the author. The famine Irish, arriving after the potato famine of 45, 46 to 50, are now in New York and ambitious, saving money. The Emigrant Savings Bank tells the story of success and less than success, people climbing up the ladder of success from unskilled labor to professionals, and in between are business owners. And along comes the Civil War and the breakdown of order in the United States of America, which heretofore has been seen as nirvana. However, in New York, there is the Irish Brigade, the 69th, and a number of these famine Irish have joined it already. Timothy Carr is one name, and James Kavanaugh is another name. Professor, thank you very much for this. The 69th Regiment, it's a volunteer regiment. They join, they meet on weekends, but suddenly there's a war, and they're called to the front line. They're called to Washington. What made up the Irish Brigade? Why did the Irish participate in what appears to be a war to existential war for a country they've just arrived in?
Well, so Irish immigrants initially joined the 69th Regiment of the New York State Militia, what today would be the equivalent to the National Guard. It was the kind of thing, as you mentioned, where you would, spend maybe one weekend a month training, doing military training, which mostly was just kind of target shooting out in the park. Most of the Irish join organizations like that initially because they want military training, because they're hoping to be able to go back to Ireland and free Ireland from British rule. But here comes the Civil War in 1861, and now these militia units are called to Washington to defend the capital and then eventually fight the Civil War. And you might think, well, maybe these units wouldn't want to participate in a war like that was, seemed like a squabble between Americans. But the Irish who joined these militia units were, for the most part, enthusiastic supporters of the Union effort, because they felt a debt to the United States. The United States had helped give them financial success and security. And so the Irish wanted to pay that back by fighting to sustain the country that had been so good to them so far, even though there had been, it's not that they were all welcomed with open arms, but still they felt a debt of gratitude that they wanted to repay. And so the 69th goes to Washington and ends up fighting in all the major battles in the Eastern theater of the Civil War. They're thrown into action immediately at Bull Run. They suffer the very first casualties. In fact, you mentioned the very first wounded soldier in the Battle of Bull Run supposedly is Timothy Carr, who is a day laborer in New York, who joins the 69th Regiment and is struck down at the initial Battle of Bull Run in the summer of 1861.
Timothy Carr, day laborer. And then there's James Kavanaugh, 5'6" from Tipperary. Remember, because of Immigrant Savings Bank, we have all the records of where they were born, where they came from, what ship they took. He runs, when he first arrives in New York, 1851, He runs a grocery, and following the professor's reporting, thanks to the Emigrant Savings Bank test book, and then a liquor store on Cedar Street in Ward 1. However, he joins the 69th and becomes a captain, so that he's one of the senior commanders when it goes off to war. The story, again, is that 69th is thrown right into Bull Run, and then it's thrown into Malvern Hill, which was the failed campaign of the Union to win in 62. And there he is at Antietam with the 69th in the middle of a fight that was, well, it was a horrendous battle. It was the worst day America had ever suffered on a battlefield. And General Winfield Scott rides up to Kavanaugh, who's leading a beleaguered and extremely reduced 69th. I think they were down to about 1,000 men at the time. And what does the general ask, and what does Captain Kavanaugh answer, Professor?
So this is at the most pivotal point at what you could say is the most pivotal battle of the entire Civil War, Antietam, where the Confederates have come into the North, into Maryland, and are threatening to overrun the Union forces led by General McClellan and perhaps end the war right there. And the 69th, known as the Fighting 69th, was at the very center of the battle lines. And as you said, they are very thinned out, just down to a couple of hundred, actually, from 1,000 where they started at the beginning of the day to just a couple of hundred men. And the general rides up to Kavanaugh and says, "How long do you think your men can hold this position?" And Kavanaugh says, "We can hold it until they kill the very last one of us." And a cheer goes up among the beleaguered men, and they do hold the position and mount a counter-offensive against Lee. Push Lee back to the Potomac, and the North carries the day there.
You'd think that was enough, but no, they're at the Fredericksburg in December of 62. And the Union launches what would be, at this point, a completely self-destructive advance. The 69th is ordered in against the dug-in Confederates on Marye's Hill. And there is no way this can be successful. But Kavanaugh continues to lead them until he's shot in the hip. The fact that he didn't die at this point, I was certain he was dead, Professor. I was amazed that he survived this.
Right, he's shot both in the hip and the shoulder, and in those days, getting a wound like that can often be fatal, if not from the blood loss, from the infections that one might get. But luckily, he's carted off the field by his men. He's treated by an Irish immigrant doctor who is part of the unit, and he manages to survive. But yes, that was a very dark day for the Union forces trying to move Robert E. Lee off of Marye's Heights, which, as you note, was an impossibility.
Yes, the fact that they were ordered to advance is flabbergasting and not good generalship. Now, what comes after the war? Mr. Kavanaugh never goes back into combat. He becomes part of I think they called it the Invalid Corps, helping to recruit sort of like a militia at home from the wounded. The war ends, but there is no reward for the great army that has won. I don't think pensions start until the 1890s. Is that right, Tyler?
Right, till the late 19th century. So, right, there's no pension for the Civil War soldiers for several decades. What happens to him, and this is a great illustration of kind of the ironies of serving in the Civil War, earning fame. So Kavanaugh becomes one of the most famous soldiers from New York, one of the most famous soldiers in the entire Union Army for his valiant stands at Antietam and at Fredericksburg, as you mentioned. And yet he goes back to New York, and he becomes a carpenter after the war. He had, as you mentioned, he had run a grocery and a saloon before the war that he had kind of taken over from his wife's previous husband, and those didn't survive the war. He'd been a tailor before that, and he goes back to being a carpenter, and he goes back to that, tries becoming a builder, but doesn't succeed at that. So he's just a kind of lowly carpenter, you could say. And seeing this 25 years after the war, New York politicians feel bad for him. And so they find him a position in the customs house in Brooklyn as a supervisor of those whose job it is to evaluate the value of the goods coming into the country and levy the tariffs on imports. And so he ends up with a civil service job towards the end of his life as a kind of payment of gratitude for what he had done to help keep the United States alive during the Civil War.
Was the Dr. William O'Mare, was he with Irish Brigade? Did he treat Kavanaugh, or is that a different story?
No, that's correct. That's the same one. So that Dr. Wright, who is also an Irish immigrant, treats Kavanaugh and some of the other wounded at Fredericksburg and at all the battles of the Irish Brigade. In fact, he's captured 3 times during the war because he stays on the battlefield after the Union has retreated to treat the Union wounded. And so he's captured 3 times during the war, but eventually is released and goes on and serves again.
And becomes successful after the war. He eventually becomes coroner for New York City. Remember, always this push to move up to the professionals at the top. And William O'Mare was certainly an example. There's also a wonderful example of a dance teacher who disguised his Irishness with his name, Professor Judson Sauce. And this gives us an opportunity to talk about Prejudice. The Prejudice was everywhere. You have advertisements illustrated in your book where it's no Irish need apply, or they say preferring French or English. That prejudice was based, as I follow your reporting, entirely on religion. Is that correct?
It's mostly religion, but there's even some belief that the Irish are a separate quote unquote race, and as a race are inferior to the supposedly Anglo-Saxon race. But yes, most of it is due to the Irish immigrants' Catholicism, and there's a great prejudice against Catholics in 19th century America. So exactly, Judson Sauce, he goes by Judson because it doesn't sound very Irish, and he already has a not very sounding Irish surname. But he hides his Irishness and stops becoming he starts out in America as a tool maker, and instead becomes a ballroom dance teacher and teaches ballroom dance in Manhattan for decades and becomes one of the most famous dance teachers in America.
The book is Plentiful Country, The Great Potato Famine and the Making of Irish New York. Tyler Anbinder is the author. The immigrants are arriving at first just into the east side, the North River it was called, the Hudson now, and the east side, the East River. They arrive on both sides, but there's no collection point. That changes in the 1850s with the choice of Castle Garden. And one particular famine Irish, Hubert Glynn, gets an important post at the Castle Garden. Who was Hubert Glynn, and what did he do for many years?
Hubert Glynn comes to America from the west coast of Ireland. He's not your typical Irish immigrant. He had actually begun college before coming to America in 1851. Also, being from the West, he spoke both English and Irish. And when he gets to New York, he looks for a job that he feels is commensurate with his educational level. He wants a white-collar job. And he finds that the New York City Commissioners of Immigration, or New York State Commissioners of Immigration, in those days, immigration was regulated by the states, not by the federal government. It's only after the Civil War that the Supreme Court rules that only the federal government can regulate immigration. And so the state officials who regulate immigration into New York City need someone to work for them who speaks Irish also, because they have people speaking only Irish coming into their facilities and looking for work. So they hire Hubert Glynn as a clerk and someone who can talk to the Irish immigrants. And eventually, in the middle of the 1850s, at the very end of the famine migration, the New York State officials decide that they want to create one central place where all immigrants will land. So they can take down information about each immigrant who comes to the United States and protect the immigrants from swindlers who would hang out at the docks and try to swindle the immigrants when they first arrive. And they choose this little artificial island that's built at the bottom of Manhattan that had been called Castle Clinton as a fortification. Eventually, a theater was built on top of it. And now the commissioners buy the theater and turned it into an immigration reception station that's known as Castle Garden. And Hubert Glynn is put by the commissioners in charge of all the record keeping that's collected about the immigrants for Castle Garden. And he ends up serving in that position for almost 40 years.
Yes, and those records, if we only had those, you're the closest thing to those records, the Emigrant Savings Bank, destroyed by fire. His notes would tell us so much more about all the people that arrived, not just the bank savers.
Right, because at Castle Garden, they took that information about every person who arrived, and more information than we have today. Many people may be familiar with the ship manifest that you often see on Ancestry.com that will list the name of each person who came on a ship, but usually nothing more than that. The records from Castle Garden had their names, the occupations, where people came from, and also how much money they brought with them to America. But as you note, all those records, when Ellis Island opens in 1892, the federal officials insist that the Castle Garden records be brought there. And just a few years after Ellis Island opens, the entire building and these records is burned to the ground and destroyed. And so all of Glynn's 40 years work was lost in that fire in 1896.
One more detail about the politics of the period with the famine Irish and Irish who arrived afterwards. Professor, what was the Know Nothing Party?
The Know Nothing Party was a political movement from the middle of the 1850s that sought to take political power away from immigrants in general, but their main focus was Irish Catholic immigrants. And so what the Know Nothings wanted to do was to pass laws and even enact constitutional amendments that would, in particular, change the laws that said that immigrants had to wait 5 years after arriving in the United States before they could vote, and change it to a 21-year wait. And they thought in that way, they would disenfranchise the famine immigrants and keep the Irish from gaining what they considered to be too much political power in the United States. And the Know Nothings do very well in 1854. They especially in New England, they carry almost every legislative seat in Massachusetts and New Hampshire as well. They elect about a half dozen governors. They elect about 100 congressmen. But luckily, before they can accomplish very much, the country becomes overwhelmed with the fear that the slave power, those who own slaves, are a bigger threat than immigrants. And so the Know Nothing movement, though important and though it scars the immigrants, fades from the scene relatively quickly.
So what we have here is the coterminous with the rise of the Republican Party, which is abolitionist, and the Know Nothing Party, which is anti-Catholic. And eventually those prejudices will right themselves. I believe there was even dynamiting of some Catholic churches at the time. It was a violent underground. Know Nothing was the product of hiding your affiliation. And when people asked you, do you belong to, and they called themselves the American Party, the Star Spangled Party, you were supposed to say, I know nothing. That was the cleverness that was practiced by Prejudice. Professor Tyler Anbinder, Plentiful Country, the Great Potato Famine and the Making of Irish New York. Irish New York decides that there's opportunity in America. And we go to, right now, one particular opportunity with the New York Central Railroad by John and Honora Killeen, who happen to be a relative of the author Tyler Anbinder. I understand, Professor, if my notes is correct, you're related to the Killeens via Vivian O'Connor, your aunt. Is that correct?
Correct, Vivian O'Connor Malloy. And her great-great-grandfather was a famine immigrant who came from County Clare and came through New York, but moved fairly quickly. And this is an important part of the story is as you noted, about 1 million famine immigrants come to New York City and land in New York City. Many of them move on right away. Many more stay in New York for several months or years before going elsewhere. And one of those was John Colleen. He finds that there's much more work and better paying work further west. And so he goes to Buffalo and works for the New York Central Railroad and gets a job with them by the early 1850s and works for them for more than 3 decades until he's 80 years old. And works for the New York Central, always in a menial position. But on the other hand, his children are able to, as you've noted, kind of climb the socioeconomic ladder. Some of them work menial positions, but others go on. The one who's my direct ancestor becomes a famous policeman in Buffalo, police captain there, which was a very important position in the community back then. And his brother becomes a prominent corporate lawyer in Buffalo. So you have all sorts of means to climb the socioeconomic ladder that the Irish managed to do.
14 children. It's impressive for any generation.
14 children, yes. And what I found amazing was not only that John and Honora had 14 children, but that wasn't even such an extraordinary number in the book. I have plenty of other famine immigrants who end up with that many children. I never found one with 15. 14 was the most I ever found.
Also traveling are the Lynches. Peter Lynch, his brothers and sisters and wives, they travel to Illinois thinking that with the money we've saved, and it's a considerable amount after working many years from 46 to 56, 54, 56 in New York, we're going to buy a farm. We're going to become farmers. But when he arrives in Illinois, he realizes the land is extremely expensive, $50. My note says $50 an acre. However, he hears about Minnesota. So he goes farther west and he comes to a place where he can buy 80 acres for $100. And what I like about Peter is that he's calculating. I'll take this land, but I'll build a tent because that satisfies the idea that I'm bettering the land. It's mostly trees. And then he goes to work in the big town. He goes back to St. Paul and gets a job. Or does he go all the way back to New York to get his family? I can't remember.
Well, he does both. He goes back to New York, gets his wife and his brother, and they come and they work in St. Paul. And then eventually when the weather gets better in the spring, go back and start working, start building the farm. And right, so the Lynches are a great story because as you mentioned, they get to America and their plan had been immediately to go to Illinois and start a farm, but they realized they didn't have enough money to do that. So they work for 10 years in New York. Peter works in a sugar refinery as a laborer and a porter. And then after a decade, they say, all right, we have enough money. We'll go west. But as you note, they decide, we can hardly buy anything in Illinois now, but out here in Minnesota, we can get government land for, barely $1 an acre. And so they go out there, even though it's there's hardly any people living there at that point, and it's the quote unquote farms are mostly forest. And yet they decide rather than spend $50 an acre, they'll spend $1 an acre and they'll cut down the trees and they'll somehow eke out a living there. And they create whole communities of Irish farmers in the Minnesota wilderness. And the Irish even there kind of stick together and help each other to become successful.
And it's like Sim City. You show up and you're building and they build a log cabin, but then it gets larger and they build a regular house and they acquire pigs, oxen, milk cows, 6 pigs. The danger in the area is bears coming out of the forest because they're surrounded by beautiful trees. Eventually, those trees will be cut down because America needs them. However, at the time they were there, they were settlers. What is most moving about the Lynches is the professor takes us to a graveyard near at hand. This is in a bend in the Minnesota River. Carney and Kavanaugh, Donovan and Duffy, Fahey and Fitzgerald, McCarthy and this is like a song, Professor. It's like or a heroic poem. All Irish names in the graveyard. So the Lynches were either pioneers or the word got around. You can buy a whole lot of land in Minnesota.
They were pioneers, but and yet they used word of mouth to bring other Irish immigrants to the same place. So Minnesota at the time they lived there is mostly German, but they created this little Irish enclave within a German county in Minnesota. And as you note, the names on the gravestones reflect how Irish that part of Minnesota became.
All of America was not equally attractive. I learned from the professor that it was not popular to go south. Some did, and some did very well, but it was not popular. Edmund Butler, I believe, went south, and he has another story you can't make up. He winds up in the military. Is he the one that took on Crazy Horse, the Butlers?
He is, right. So he goes west as a result of the Civil War. He works for a newspaper as an editor before the Civil War. He volunteers for the Union Army during the Civil War, is sent to Kansas to recruit, so to both organize soldiers out west and to guard Confederate prisoners there. And after the war, when most soldiers go home, he likes the Army. He stays in the Army. And the main focus of the Army in the West after the Civil War was reining in the threat of Indians in the West. And so after the Battle of Little Bighorn, where Custer dies and his entire regiment is wiped out by Indians led by Crazy Horse, Edmund Butler, an Irish immigrant, is sent to go and subdue Crazy Horse. And so they go and chase Crazy Horse into Montana in negative 30-degree weather through snowdrifts, and eventually catch up to Crazy Horse, and in a dramatic battle are able to defeat Crazy Horse, push him out of southern Montana, and in that way make that part of America safe for white settlement.
California. It is not inconsiderable for the Irish who arrive in New York. And one particular family, I believe it's the Ruddocks, traveled to California. James and John, there might be more. There's always more in the family. Andrew, George, Benjamin. They go to San Francisco because they're looking for they want to become miners. They've missed the gold rush of 49, but they're hopeful. And they spend time in a place called Jamestown as miners. The success, however, is one of them forms a boarding house. Do we know, are the Ruddocks still in California? Is there it sounds like this is only, 160, 70 years ago. I'm sure they are.
Probably. The Ruddocks were a family I was not able, one of the great things of working on the book was I was able, with many of these protagonists we've talked about today, to find living descendants. The Ruddocks were not a family I was able to find living descendants of, but it's likely there are still some of them in California. The Ruddocks were interesting because, as you said, they go to California hoping to strike it rich in the gold rush. They arrive a little too late, but what the Irish do is, the Irish are so entrepreneurial. That's the thing we haven't really understood very well about the famine immigrants. We think of them as oppressed, and they were definitely discriminated against, but they didn't let that stop them. And they were very entrepreneurial, very interested in moving up the socioeconomic ladder. And California seemed like the ideal place to do that because it was such a huge place with so few inhabitants relatively. And so the Irish go there, and even when they don't find gold, they start other businesses. And so the Ruddocks supply other miners with clothing. And then they also move to San Francisco and invest in San Francisco real estate. And towards the end of their lives, they become landlords and rent tenement apartments to Italian immigrants, and so become successful in that way. And so that's the kind of thing we find about the Irish immigrants, is not only entrepreneurial, but they're very resourceful, and they don't give up. When one business fails, they start another. And if that fails, they start a third. And that's the way they end up succeeding in America.
Not every Irish immigrant is successful in his occupation, and sometimes his son takes up the same occupation. That would describe the Quigleys. This is a very colorful story. Michael Quigley, Tyler presents him as a huge man, over 6 feet, 200 pounds. He has a rowboat, and that rowboat becomes famous, celebrated in southern Manhattan, meeting all the ship captains as they arrive. He also is hired by the politicians in the area. What do they want? He's a strong man, but what do they have him do on election day?
Right. Michael Quigley is another entrepreneur who starts as a day laborer, but notices that there's lots of business to be done in the harbor. And so he buys a rowboat and he rows out to captains in the harbor because not everyone can get a dock. And he says, "Do you want me to bring you anything from shore?" And they'll say, "Sure, I'll pay you this amount of money if you bring me some groceries." And he starts a business that way and eventually runs a boat rental dock where people can go on rent boats and row out in the harbor. But he's also very popular with the politicians because he's so big and strong, right? To row a boat around the harbor, you're going to become big and strong. And on election days in those days, it was common for politicians, in order to encourage their supporters to vote and discourage their opponents from voting, to place people like Quigley at the polls. And in those days, there was not a secret ballot. You walked into the polling place with a piece of paper that listed the names of the people you were going to vote for, and you had to put that piece of paper in a glass bowl. So Quigley and people like him would stand at the entrance to the polling place and demand to see the ballot that people were bringing in. And if they liked the ballot, they let you pass. If they didn't like the ballot, they might rough you up and say, "You still want to vote?" And in that way, they would discourage their opponents from voting and hope to win the elections that way. And that was a very common thing, voting in 19th century New York. It was the kind of thing where you could get roughed up. You never wore your nicest clothes to vote on election day as a result.
Michael Quigley, unfortunately, had a sad end because he drank self-destructively and eventually died of it. And it was a disappointment to all who knew him as a famous character. However, along comes Bill Quigley, his son, who becomes the new boatman. Is that how to think of this? I want to have a happy end for the Quigleys.
Yes. So his son, Bill, as a 16-year-old, has to take over the family boat dock because his father is incapacitated by alcoholism and dies a couple of years later of cirrhosis of the liver. But Bill takes over the family business, becomes just as famous a lower Manhattan character. And he, unlike his father, lives a long life, is in the press all the time. When newspaper men are looking for colorful stories about what's happening in lower Manhattan, they go to Bill Quigley, and he's always ready to spin a yarn for them. And so, yes, he lives a long life, unlike his father, who has such a tragic ending.
The book is Plentiful Country, The Great Potato Famine, and the Making of Irish New York. We're in a moment now when entrepreneurial fever strikes a note of genius. There's a man named Phelan, who's an extremely famous billiards player. Huge crowds gather around him. There's a man named Callender, who has the good sense to marry Phelan's daughter, 15-year-old daughter, and live happily with her. However, the two of them have an idea, which is to mass produce pool tables. But how to win the favor of so many pool table makers in New York, billiards tables? The idea is to make a table like no other. Professor, Ulysses Grant is a pool player. What do they do for him?
So Phelan and Callender, as you mentioned, create what's considered the best pool table of the era. Michael Phelan was a famous billiards champion, but always complained that the rails on the pool tables did not give accurate caroms. And he complained about this, and his son-in-law, who was not much of a pool player, but had a nose for business, said, "We can make some money on this. We're going to patent this." And so the son-in-law patents Phelan's idea for better pool table cushions. And then they start making pool tables. And they immediately become a success. Phelan is so famous, so successful that they are the most popular pool table in the Eastern United States by the end of the Civil War. And one of the people who loves playing pool, it turns out, is the most famous general from that Civil War, Ulysses S. Grant. And in the period after the Civil War, he makes a good deal of money from his fame. And one of the things he does with his earnings is he wants to buy himself one of these famous Phelan and Colander pool tables. And so he goes to their showroom in Lower Manhattan and orders one. But the owners, Phelan and Colander, two Irish immigrants, they decide we can't just give an ordinary table to the savior of the country. And so they make him a magnificent table with gold ornamentation on it with the general's initials and so forth. And they bring in the press to see this magnificent table. And so it's written up in the press all over the country, and they deliver it to Grant. And so a year later, when Grant is elected president, he then brings it to the White House and creates in what would become the West Wing a pool room in which he shows off his pool skills to his guests and forces them to play pool with him, even if they're against their wishes.
You have a photograph of the pool table in your book. Not a photograph, a drawing. But the one that compels me is the drawing of Phelan and Colander billiards tables, a factory on 10th Avenue. Is anything left of that? Because there's some buildings over there that haven't been renovated.
No, that building, that was a factory that stretched the length from 27th to 28th Street. The entire west side of 10th Avenue was this huge factory to make their pool tables. But they were so popular that they ended up moving not very long after they moved into that factory into an even bigger factory in Stamford, Connecticut, and that was torn down and replaced. So no, there's nothing left of the Phelan and Colander 10th Avenue pool table factory.
The photograph is so striking to remember that Manhattan and New York in general was a manufacturing hub for the 19th century, not a services hub as it is today. And factories were always billowing smoke in the area, but this time it seems excusable, making magnificent pool tables for Ulysses Grant. Now that we've gone through as best we can, there's so many more stories here. I feel that we've left out, I must have missed something to talk to the professor about. There are all these stories. Some of them end tragically, others end with great success, great wealth, that 160, 170 years later, it begins to answer questions about how America was stronger because all these people came and mixed together. Professor, in the course of compiling all this from the digitalization records, what did you learn? We have about 30 seconds. Is there one thing that you learned that you hadn't understood before about the Irish in America?
The thing I learned that most surprised me was, the famine Irish are always portrayed as kind of coming to America, getting the worst jobs in America and being stuck in them for their whole lives because of discrimination and a lack of education. And so I was shocked to see how many of the famine Irish actually pulled themselves up by their own bootstraps, so to speak, and were able to climb the socioeconomic ladder. Not always as dramatically as Hugh Colander, who goes from a drapery maker to one of the richest men in America on the back of his pool table business, but even in more modest ways, that the Irish were very determined, very ambitious, and very entrepreneurial. And even those who came during the famine managed to improve their lives in the United States.
Tyler Anbinder is Emeritus Professor of History at George Washington University. Plentiful Country is his new book, The Great Potato Famine and the Making of Irish New York. I'm John Batchelor.